Gay and transgender workers are protected by the Civil Rights Act. That was the decision last week from the Supreme Court. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a conservative appointed to the court by President Donald Trump, led the 6-3 majority. In his decision, Gorsuch wrote that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act makes it illegal for an employer to rely on an employee's sex when deciding to fire that employee. As a result, quote, an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law. I asked Lee Badgett, a professor and co-director of the UMass Amherst Center for Employment Equity, if the ruling surprised her.
Oh, I was shocked, but by two things. I mean, not so much the actual decision itself, as much as who wrote the decision, and the fact that it actually got 6 votes, and so it was very surprising in that sense.
To your point, Justice Gorsuch, who President Trump, he was his first pick, first nomination to the Supreme Court, I should say. He wrote the 6-3 decision, and that stood out to you. When you were reading through, did anything that he wrote or the way that he positioned the argument stand out to you?
He made it sound so obvious. It was very clearly written. Apparently that's something that he's known for. And he spoke very, very plainly about the fact that discrimination against LGBT people is in fact sex discrimination. And he used very common sense sort of arguments, I think, that would be familiar, be intelligible to people who aren't lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, for example, but he made it seem very, very clear cut. At one point he said, you know, you can't even explain what sexual orientation or gender identity mean without using the concepts of sex. So they overlap to the point where in the laws that we have at the federal level that say we can't discriminate against sex discrimination can be used to protect LGBT people, because that discrimination is sex discrimination.
Now, on the opposing side, Justice Kavanaugh wrote in his ruling in part that really he didn't think that this was something the court needed to weigh in on. It shouldn't have been a court decision. Congress, in his opinion, should have stepped in and done something. Do you think that Congress has a role to play here and should be making a different move?
Well, there have been bills in Congress for many decades related to non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and more recently gender identity. And for whatever reason, it's a little bit hard to know why they haven't acted, but has not made it through both houses of Congress. And to me, what was more striking about what both Kavanaugh and Alito said, Alito wrote the other dissent, was that they basically seem to agree that discrimination against LGBT people was a bad idea. It was a bad thing to allow, but they differed in terms of, you know, how they thought that should be changed. So I think, you know, the courts are there to interpret laws in this case, and to say when there are things that have changed. One of the things that Gorsuch's opinion said was, we didn't know in 1964 when sex discrimination was outlawed, we didn't know that eventually we'd be thinking about other things as also reflecting sex discrimination, like sexual harassment, for example. So it's not that surprising that we can find some other ways to some other situations where we're seeing sex discrimination, like with regard to LGBT people. So that's part of what the Supreme Court does. So it's a different role than what they played in the marriage equality decision, where they were really looking at kind of fundamental rights. In this case, it was really, what does this law mean?
I think it was the New York Times. I was reading the New York Times that they positioned this as a bigger case than even the marriage equality case, because almost everybody works. And this, by current counts, about 8 million people who are LGBTQ are working at this point. And the point that the Times was making, this is a bigger decision because it impacts more people. Do you think that that's the position you hold too?
Well, I'm not sure we really have to decide that, frankly. I think they're both extremely important. They kind of deal with different aspects of people's lives, but they also actually fit together in a really important way. One of the things that we learned was after marriage equality was happening nationwide. As the saying goes, people would get married on Sunday and be fired from their jobs on Monday. And sometimes that literally did happen. Marriage is something that's very public. People talk about it. People invite their coworkers to their weddings sometimes. So it does, in many cases, it leads to people being much more open, much more out. And when they're in a situation like in their jobs where they're vulnerable to discrimination, it's not surprising that we've seen that happen. But this will actually give those workers who have that experience a way to seek justice, to seek redress for something that's been done to them that was unfair and is now very clearly illegal.
As an economist, you've looked at this issue. You've written about the economics of gay and lesbian people. What do you think the economic impact of having this decision as something that you can point to as, hey, you can't do this to me now? What do you think that impact will be?
I think it will be very positive, not just for the LGBT people themselves, but for their employers and actually for our economy as a whole. What discrimination does is that it takes people out of jobs where they can actually best apply their skills, their knowledge, their creativity in ways that'll be good for the employer. And those things also matter a lot for how well our economy functions. I mean, we're in a deep recession right now, and we know that we have lots of people who are not being fully utilized. We have a very high unemployment rate. Well, it's the same kind of thing for LGBT people, except it happens all the time. It kind of puts us in a certain sense in kind of a permanent recession when we're not fully utilizing people's abilities. We call it human capital in economics. We know, for example, that businesses that treat their LGBT employees with more equitable policies do better. They have higher productivity, they have higher stock prices, their profits go up. And all of that matters for how our overall economy functions as well.
Do you have a sense of how often that this was happening, that people were being discriminated against in this way? I mean, we go back to the 50s and you can talk about the lavender scare, but was this something that was persisting through to this day? There were 3 people who stood up that were attached to this particular case.
3 people in very different kinds of jobs, which is interesting. Yeah, it is still very common. When we do surveys of LGBT people, about 1 in 5 report that they've been discriminated against, and often fairly recently, more in some places than in others. Every year, thousands of people file charges against their employer in the states that allow those charges to be filed. Actually, one of the things that people don't always realize is that the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which enforces all of our civil rights laws, had also already had this interpretation of LGBT discrimination, that it was sex discrimination. So they were allowing people to file charges, and thousands are doing so every year. Many of them with the EEOC in states that didn't have state laws. So there were a lot of people who would have had those protections yanked out from under them if the Supreme Court had decided this case very differently. So it's really had an impact on millions of people. We think about 8 million LGBT people are in the workforce, and about half of them, or 4 million people, would have lost their protections had this gone in a different direction.
Do you think that this case will now clear the way for other issues of discrimination to come up and be addressed?
I hope so. There certainly are many areas where there aren't the same kinds of discrimination protections. So when we talk about housing, when we talk about credit, when we talk about public accommodations, being how people are treated in businesses, those are all examples of places where there aren't any clear-cut federal protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So there's still some big holes that need to be filled. But it may be that this idea that LGBT discrimination is sex discrimination can hold in those places too. But it's always good to have somebody say really specifically in a law that yes, it's included, it's covered by the law because we're explicitly going to say that. We're going to say it's illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So there is a bill before Congress, the Equality Act, that would actually accomplish that in many different other areas that are important. So there are still important things to do there, and we're still learning about good ways to identify and actually try to reduce the amount of discrimination that might happen. Public policy is just one way to do that, where you tell businesses they can't do it. But of course, we know, businesses can't control all of the people who worked for them and keep them from harassing someone or keep them from discriminating in some other kind of way. So we need to keep working on that to identify what best practices employers can take up to get their employees in line with this policy.